This is an urgent country emergency broadcast.
Welcome, listener. I don't know how you found this frequency, but something tells me it wasn't by accident. I've been sifting through the usual static and stumbled on something that doesn't belong. A low, droning hum that's less like a transmission and more like a tape loop stuck on repeat. A few words, a faint clang, the hiss of a deep fryer. Normally, I'd ignore it. But there's a distinct undercurrent beneath the neon facade, a bright jingle playing over fluorescent lights, and a strange hush the moment someone unexpected shows up. It's a roadside restaurant, new and gleaming, yet somehow haunted by cheap plastic fixtures and a manager who watches the door more than he serves his customers. A patron's camcorder keeps rolling, capturing a place too perfect to fully trust. And when a grinning figure steps through the entrance, clad in red, yellow, and white, the entire place goes quiet in a way that suggests we aren't just dealing with greasy burgers and a kids' play area. This is the fragment I've managed to piece together. Lean closer and listen. Perhaps you'll sense what's lurking behind the plastic decor and polite smiles, because something tells me the real show is only just beginning.
The restaurant rose out of the asphalt like a Formica monument to consumerism. Its curved arches glowed in a neon hush, illuminating a sea of parked sedans. Families slipped inside to the faint clang of the aluminum doorframe. The moment they crossed the threshold, the world outside seemed to vanish. Here, under the fluorescent strip lights, everything was clean and bright. Sterile tile floors, molded seating the color of ketchup and mustard. A tinny jingle drifting through hidden ceiling speakers, looping incessantly. Children pounded across a new play area, coated in glossy red and yellow. Its tunnels smelled of fresh vinyl, the sort of chemical tang that clung to your skin. A father stood nearby, hefting a bulky camcorder that whirred each time he adjusted focus. He captured the slide from every angle, even zooming in on a smudge of grease near a ladder rung. Across the room, two teens in matching windbreakers slumped in a booth, sipping sodas that fizzed softly, eyes wandering over identical printed trays. A manager lingered behind the counter, name tag pinned to his pressed shirt. He watched the ebb and flow of customers, with an expression bordering on impatience. Now and then, he flicked a glance at the glass doors as if expecting a special guest, either that or bracing for one. When the doors opened for a mother herding two shrieking toddlers, his face flickered with something like relief, then soured with disappointment. At the condiment stand, a woman with teased hair carefully peeled open ketchup packets, smoothing each one flat, before emptying it onto a small paper tray. She arranged the sauces in neat circles, a private ritual that she performed with unblinking focus. The overhead lights sharpened every shadow, so that even the crease of her jeans looked stark, a line carved into the cheap denim. She kept glancing at a poster on the far wall, a cartoon hamburger with rolling eyes and a grin, beaming from behind a pair of golden-arched glasses, its smile never faltering. The place was new enough that even the undersides of the tables harbored no chewing gum. Yet, customers stepped gingerly, as though uncertain whether they were allowed to disrupt the pristine sheen of the floor tiles. Across the dining area, a row of plastic plants stood guard by the windows, leaves painted in a permanent shade of green. They offered no fragrance, only the comic facsimile of life. Beyond them, the night settled in, reflecting the interior's fluorescent glow in the glass so clearly that the restaurant became its own mirrored diorama. A tall teenager in acid-wash jeans and white Chuck Taylors hovered at the counter, counting coins in his palm. The register beeped with each entry, manned by a girl in a red and white striped polo and visor. She moved efficiently, passing a paper cup and folded receipt across the counter. Their mutual disinterest formed an invisible wall between them, a well-rehearsed exchange of goods for currency. A half step behind the teen, an older woman with a loose perm studied the menu overhead like it was a crossword puzzle. Time slowed under those lights. Every plastic tray and waxed wrapper seemed locked in place, forming a tableau of manufactured cheer. Nobody questioned the blandness. They just navigated it, each with their own personal orbit. Somewhere under the clamor, the fryers hissed. The scent of hot oil drifted in waves, coating every surface in a layer of invisible grease. Another beep echoed from the kitchen, prompting one of the cooks, a lanky boy with wire-rimmed glasses, to pull a fresh batch of fries. Steam curled upward, vanishing into the whir of an overhead vent. Near the restrooms, someone had set out a life-sized cardboard cutout. A grinning clown figure, arm raised, mid-wave. It wore the restaurant's colors, a jarring combination of red, white, and yellow. A small child approached, pressing sticky fingers to the cardboard with reverence. The cutout wobbled on its flimsy base, and for a moment, it seemed to breathe. The child jumped back, uncertain, then scampered off. The manager passed by with a forced smile, scanning each booth, mentally tallying heads. His face twitched each time he neared the windows. Every squeal from the play area made him flinch, as if the bright plastic tubes might break. At one point, he paused to help a customer with an overflowing soda cup. Syrupy foam soaked into the cuff of his shirt, but he kept smiling, ignoring the cold stickiness. Behind him, his staff carried on, bagging orders, wiping counters, discarding half-eaten meals. The overhead jingle looped again, with no sign of relenting. As darkness descended over the parking lot, the bright overhead lights became stark, bleaching the restaurant interior of any softness. The father with the camcorder recorded everything in a slow pan. The teens, the older couples, even a deserted booth that housed nothing but a lone plastic ketchup bottle. He pivoted to capture the manager at the glass doors, adjusting a taped flyer advertising kids' parties. In the tiny viewfinder, the manager's expression looked ghostly, washed out by fluorescent glare. Again the doors opened, but this time without a sound. A chill slipped in from the night, carrying a hush that seemed to muffle every beep and slurp. The father paused mid-pan, the lens halting on the entrance. Two children stopped racing around the chairs. Even the cook in the back forgot his rapidly burning fries. The new arrival stood tall in the threshold, clothed head to toe in red, yellow, and white. At first glance, it seemed like a promotional standee come to life. But then the figure lifted a gloved hand in greeting, a broad grin stretching across its waxy, grease-painted face. The manager exhaled, shoulders sagging as if he'd been holding that breath for hours. Behind the counter, the girl in the visor whispered something to her coworker, eyes fixed on the newcomer. A child tugged at his sister's sleeve, pointing in mute awe. The man raised his camcorder again, but found his hands unsteady. The lens wavered, capturing fleeting glimpses of a face too bright under the lights, red curls glowing like embers. "Hello, friends." The words emerged soft, yet they rippled across the restaurant with unnatural clarity. The clown stepped forward, each comically oversized footstep squeaking on the polished tile. The jingle overhead stumbled, then continued its cycle, as though forced to keep smiling. Somehow the place now felt less like a fast food chain store and more like a stage under glaring spotlights, where everyone waited for the performer's next line. The manager forced a cough, tried to speak, but the figure raised a gloved finger to its lips, as if suggesting a secret. And still nobody moved, nobody looked away. Overhead, the speaker looped the brand's cheerful melody once more, unable to drown out the sense that the show had finally begun. Another beat of stunned silence, and the tinny jingle overhead kicked back to life, looping through its cloying chords. Customers exhaled and blinked, as though someone had just pressed play on a paused cassette. The new arrival, yellow gloves, red curls, and a painted grin, stepped fully into the spotlight. He wore the same corporate colors as the posters on the wall and the tiles on the floor. Yet an unsettling energy radiated from him, placing him at odds with normalcy itself. The manager tried to muster his usual greeting, but the clown beat him to it. "Well, well," it purred, voice dripping with theatrical delight. "What a lively bunch." His words swept over the hushed crowd, pulling them in like an undertow. It seemed impossible not to smile, or at least twitch one's lips in response. Parents found themselves nodding along. Kids stared wide-eyed, too young to sense the tension coiled beneath his showman's charm. The clown clapped his gloved hands with a crisp snap. "Come on now," it said, beckoning. "Let's see those smiles." Some of the children emerged from behind the plastic tubes in the play area. The father with the camcorder placed his elbow on the table for support and adjusted the lens. There was a strange double exposure effect as he zoomed in on the clown's grin, but he ignored it, determined to capture the magic moment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the hush in the dining area gave way to laughter and chatter. A few folks lifted their burgers and resumed eating, though their eyes kept straying toward the figure working the crowd like a seasoned professional. He moved from table to table with graceful ease, bending low to greet each customer. "You having fun yet?" it asked a young couple in a booth. The boy, face flushed, nodded too eagerly, while the girl giggled behind her hand. The clown reached out to pat the boy's shoulder, and the contact made the overhead lights flicker, just for an instant. No one said anything. They only laughed a little harder than before, as if to counter the strangeness. In the corner, the father with the camcorder tracked the clown's progress, panning to keep him in view. Through the lens, the clown's paint seemed too thick, the colors bleeding at the edges. The father frowned, tapped the side of his camera, then shrugged it off. A minute later, the clown hopped atop an empty booth seat, arms stretched wide. "I'd like to propose a toast," it announced, "to good food, good times, and even better company." With that, it bowed low. Applause burst out, sporadic but genuine. The humor started innocently enough. Light banter about how delicious the fries were, a goofy jig that made the children shriek with laughter. But as it roamed, leaning over booths, the jokes turned sharper. "You don't really need to leave, do you?" It teased a tired mother who had mentioned to her children it was time to go. "There's nowhere else that's half as tasty or half as fun. Isn't that right, kids?" Something in its tone made her pause. She stared up, eyes half-lidded with fatigue, then nodded and sank back into the booth. In the adjacent seat, her daughter was finishing a milkshake, the straw gurgling at the bottom of the cup. The mother fumbled for a napkin, but never took her eyes off the clown. "Yes," she murmured, as if lulled by its looming presence. "We'll stay, just a little longer." The clown arched a jet-black eyebrow. That's the spirit. Gradually, the place came alive with a strange new vitality. Laughter edged toward hysteria, echoing off the molded plastic. A few people rose from their booths just to follow the clown's movements, content to watch him spring from table to table, spouting one-liners that dangled on the cusp of propriety. A father let out a bark of startled mirth when the clown made a suggestive pun about buns and special sauce. He clamped a hand over his mouth, face reddening. Yet no one scolded the clown for being crass. Not a tut or a murmur. They merely giggled, entranced. The clown's antics escalated. In one corner, it mimicked the children, lowering into a bizarre twerk that might have been comedic if it weren't so off-putting. The baggy yellow trousers bobbed in a way that made a group of teens burst out laughing and blush simultaneously. An older couple looked mildly scandalized, but neither moved to leave. They just sat there, gazes locked, cheeks tinged pink with second-hand embarrassment, and a creeping fascination they couldn't explain. "Come on, folks," the clown crowed, bounding off a seat. "Don't be shy." Its grin broadened, revealing yellowed teeth under the fluorescent glare. "There's a party to be had here, isn't there? Who's with me?" Somehow, it was all too easy to say yes. The tinny jingle overhead faltered, then kicked back in at a faster tempo, as if the audio system itself were succumbing to the performance. A few customers even rose to dance, swaying unsteadily like they were tipsy on the clown's presence alone. Fries and burgers sat forgotten, going cold on trays, and burning in the grills and fryers. That was when the conga began. It started with a few reluctant folks, but soon half the restaurant was snaking around the tables in a disjointed chain, the clown at the head. Each step made the tiles squeak, and each squeak seemed in time with the beep of the fry station. The clown's laughter turned deeper, resonant. The pitch echoed from the corners of the room, making each reflection in the windows tremble. Though the conga line was messy, arms tangling, feet tripping, everyone cheered with each loop near the play area. The father with the camcorder tried to follow, filming the swirl of colors. His battery light blinked dangerously, but he refused to stop recording. Through the flicker of the viewfinder, he thought he caught tiny glimpses of the clown's face contorting in mid-laugh, the painted grin warping into something else. Yet whenever he lowered the camera, the clown looked perfectly normal, beaming merrily at the chain of dancing strangers. As the line wove past a row of booths, one customer slumped sideways, head hitting the table with a muted thud. The manager, momentarily parted from the conga, rushed over. "Sir? Sir," he whispered, shaking the man's shoulder, but the clown's voice boomed above the tune, drowning out everything else. The manager glanced around, but no one even looked. They were caught in the dance, their eyes glassy with delight. The clown beckoned for the manager to rejoin. "Don't break the chain," he teased, grin unwavering. Cold sweat beaded at the manager's temples. He laid the unconscious man carefully against the seat back. The man's eyelids fluttered, lips parted in a delirious half-smile. He wasn't dead, the manager told himself, just exhausted. The conga line circled back, a river of cheap fabric and neon apparel. Beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, the clown's shadow seemed to move oddly, twisting on the tiles like it had a separate life. For an instant, it stretched beyond the clown's figure, before snapping back into place with each overhead light. The clown seized the manager's hand, pulling him back into the line. The manager stumbled along, forced to link arms with a teenage girl who giggled and clung tightly to his waist. Around them, the tables blurred. The overhead jingle sounded distant, oddly shrill. Rounding the final bend by the counter, the clown halted, letting the chain bump into one another. It spun on oversized heels, facing the crowd with a flourish. "Fabulous," it shouted. "You're all such good sports." Its chest rose, straining against the yellow fabric as though it were breathing in more than just air. A subtle swell seemed to pass through him, like a balloon collecting just a bit more helium. No one seemed to notice. Then, with a grand bow, the clown ended the conga, prompting scattered applause. People shuffled back to their booths, panting like marathon runners, many half laughing without knowing why. One or two slouched in their seats, eyelids drooping. Children, previously indefatigable, now yawned, leaning heavily on arms sticky with soda residue. The clown stood in the center of it all, chest still gently rising and falling. His grin remained fixed, but his eyes gleamed with an intensity that bordered on hunger. A flicker passed over his face, some shadow or reflection that made his features momentarily sharper, more predatory. But in a blink, it vanished. A beep sounded from the kitchen, the forgotten fry station again, and a hush rippled through the room once more. Somewhere near the back, the unconscious man coughed feebly. The father's camcorder battery finally died, the tape whirring to an abrupt stop. The overhead jingle looped into another refrain, weaker this time, like a machine struggling to maintain power. "Should we do another round?" the clown asked, voice silky. A few people giggled, but only half-heartedly. An air of exhaustion now hung over the once gleeful crowd. But still, not one person made a move to leave. The night pressed itself against the windows like a curious spectator. But no one inside paid it any mind. Under the harsh fluorescence, the clown's crimson curls took on an almost bloody hue. A crackle of energy rippled through the air, more tangible than the friar's hiss, more oppressive than the stench of old grease. Napkins lay scattered on tables, half crumpled as though dropped mid-meal, while customers drifted about in a daze, their faces glazed with a half-smile that never quite reached their eyes. The manager slumped against the counter, struggling to shake off the fog of exhaustion and confusion clouding his mind. His shirt clung to his neck, damp with perspiration. Around him, the staff had abandoned their routine duties. They lingered near the counter or huddled in rapt groups, something about the clown's presence holding them in place. A silent command threading through every distorted jingle issuing from the speaker system. Amid the scattered clusters of diners, the clown paced slowly, surveying its captive audience. Children, normally irrepressible hurricanes of energy, were heavy-lidded and docile, yet still unable to tear their gaze away. The woman with teased hair stepped forward, whispering to the clown that she was feeling a bit dizzy. The clown responded with a pat on her shoulder. Its glove left a faint, greasy residue where it touched her blouse. The woman blinked, then returned to her seat, reassured for reasons she couldn't articulate. The manager swallowed, noticing for the first time how the clown seemed taller than before. Its shoulders filled out the yellow jumpsuit until the seams threatened to split. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if it was a trick of the harsh lighting. But the clown flexed its neck, letting out a deep, almost purring laugh. "Let's keep the good times rolling, shall we?" It clapped both hands together with a wet slap, rather than a crisp snap, and a few onlookers giggled uncertainly. The overhead lights flickered, turning everything momentarily sepia. In the brief half-darkness, the clown's grin seemed to glow, a yellow crescent cutting through the gloom. When the lights steadied, the clown took a step back, inhaling audibly. Its chest swelled against the fabric, red curls quivering with static. An overexcited teen, still running on leftover adrenaline from the earlier conga, cheered. Others followed suit, clapping in a strangely disjointed rhythm. The clown made a small, mocking curtsy in acknowledgement, its painted grin now straining at the corners, like an overfilled balloon. Then, in one sudden moment, the clown halted. Its entire body went rigid, arms half raised, knees locked. A single moan slipped between its grinning lips, low and trembling. Suddenly, the lingering chatter died, replaced by the low drone of overhead vents and the hum of the kitchen's extraction units. The manager hesitated, taking a half step forward, unsettled by the abrupt silence. Then, he heard it. The clown's breathing, deep, ragged draws of air that rattled in its chest. A jarring, wet sound emerged from the clown's core, as though something inside had begun to tear. The clown's head jerked sideways, a spasm that snapped its neck at an unnatural angle. Its grin never wavered, but the eyes bulged with something like pain. Or was it ecstasy? A single tear formed at the top of its scalp, the red curls parting like they were sliced by an invisible blade. For a frozen moment, no one in the restaurant moved or made a sound. It was like the clown was a stage magician, and they were all breathless for the reveal. Then came the first shuddering rip of skin from skull, accompanied by a slow, sucking noise. Greasy fluid oozed from the seam, dribbling down the clown's face in milky rivulets. A child whimpered. His mother covered her mouth with both hands, though she made no effort to run. The manager's stomach lurched as he caught a whiff of rancid fat and copper, like uncooked meat left too long in a warm fridge. His eyes darted to the clown's splitting scalp, transfixed despite himself. The clown's chest expanded even further, the jumpsuit stretching to the point of tearing. Then, with a long, wet slurp, the skull tore fully in half from the top, splitting down the center of what remained of the clown's painted visage. White grease paint cracked and curled, revealing glistening tissue underneath. It was as though someone had peeled a face open along the seam. The clown's eyes, one in each half, were forced outward at unnatural angles, yet they still blinked in horrific, perfect unison. All around, the customers watched as the clown tore in two, the sundered halves sloughing away from each other with glistening strands of sinew. It was less a costume and more a living hide, clinging with viscous threads that stretched and snapped. Each severed piece wobbled, thick ropes of shredded viscera, connecting them until they finally tore free. The original body collapsed outward, a trembling husk, leaving two smaller shapes behind. Both dripped with congealed fat and dark fluid that stank of old frying oil. Someone at the back of the restaurant retched, but in the hush that followed, no one else so much as rose from their seat. It was as if something beyond fear held them there, an enchantment or a collective delirium. When the last of that sticky sinew tore free, two clowns stood side by side, identical, except for the slight differences in posture and proportions. Their paint looked runny, features half-formed. One had eyes that seemed to float too high on its face. The other's grin slanted unnervingly to the left. Both jerked their arms upwards, as if testing newly minted limbs. A thick, greasy residue coated them, dribbling onto the tiles in slow, steady splats. "How's everyone? Enjoying the show?" The first clown rasped, its voice splintering like static. "We know. We're loving it." The second chimed in, a beat too slow, the words twisting into a jagged echo. They both laughed in unison, a burbling sound that reverberated off the cartoon murals. Then, as though on cue, each clown arched its back in a silent convulsion. The red curls began to tremble, growing. Bit by bit, they swelled, the fabric at their shoulders stretching taut once again. Even though they were smaller than the original at first, a new wave of expansion rippled through them, muscles and sinew sliding under their yellow jumpsuits. A moment later, a sound broke the silence. Slow, deliberate applause. One diner, face slack and eyes glazed, rose from their seat, clapping with the lifeless rhythm of someone acknowledging a cheap magic trick. Another joined in, their movements jerky, unnatural, until the entire restaurant was consumed by a hollow, mechanical ovation, a sound that echoed off the tiles like rain on a tin roof, too synchronized to feel human. Despite the gore pooling at their feet, both clowns bowed, joints cracking with the movement. Their mismatched eyes gleamed. They opened their mouths, strings of viscous fluid dangling from their lips, and began speaking at once in a garbled, overlapping pitch. "Thank you. Let's keep going." Their words slipped in and out of sync, as though played on two warped cassette tapes. Each voice quivered with delight, as if drunk on the applause. In the back, a fry station timer beeped weakly, sounding an alarm that no one moved to silence. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, the grease on the tiles glistened like the floor of an abattoir, dark and viscous, as if something vital had been drained and left to congeal. The manager pressed a hand to his mouth, fighting the urge to scream or vomit. Yet he, like everyone else, remained rooted, utterly spellbound. The new clowns stood, swaying slightly, twitching with leftover pulses of adrenaline or mania. Then they stepped forward, leaving tracks of blood-tinged grease across the floor. Their eyes scanned the motionless crowd, two sets of predatory grins widening in unison. And still, no one ran. No one even gasped. The applause finally died down to a hush, broken by the wet drip of fluid from the clown's shredded garments. Overhead, the jingle looped on in its broken refrain, as if it, too, had lost all sense of reason. From somewhere near the back, a quiet voice whispered in awe, "That's incredible." And with that, the show went on. The cloying jingle continued its endless looping refrain, a tinny skeleton of a song that refused to die. Beneath its scratchy melody, the restaurant descended into a waking nightmare. A thick, nauseating fog of grease and human sweat saturated the air, clinging to skin and clothing alike. Not a single customer made a move to leave, not the trembling mother with ketchup smeared across her chin, nor the boy whose eyes glistened with unspilled tears. They all remained, suspended in a trance-like stupor, mesmerized by the spectacle unfolding before them. At first, the two newly formed clowns seemed unsteady, their slick limbs twitching, as though still learning how to inhabit their separate bodies. They exchanged a distorted glance, one grinning mouth perched too high, the other skewed to the side, as if melting off a half-formed skull. Yet almost immediately, they began imitating the original clown's macabre performance. One limped over to a mother, cradling her half-eaten burger, bowing low as if asking for a dance. Its gloved fingers brushed her cheek, leaving behind a smear of blood and grease paint. She stared back with glassy eyes, lips parting in a vacant smile. In that instant, a shiver passed through her, the light in her gaze dulling further, as though the clown had siphoned a piece of her essence with that single mocking gesture. The second newly birthed clown lurched onto a booth bench, trying to lead an exhausted pair of teens in some grotesque parody of a line dance. Its spindly arms flailed in a rhythm no one else could follow, yet the teenagers stood as though under a spell, feet shuffling, arms limp. Their once lively chatter had devolved into feeble giggles. Each sway of the clown's hips seemed to draw out more color from their cheeks, more spark from their eyes. Slowly, more patrons turned to watch, enthralled and horrified in equal measure, feeding the clown's hunger with every slack-jawed stare. It was only after these depraved imitations of showmanship had wrung still more vigor from the petrified onlookers that the clowns convulsed again, their yellow jumpsuits bulging where spines and ribs heaved. A sudden wet rip tore through the thick silence. Each clown split from crown to crotch, flesh and fabric peeling away in uneven halves that dangled like tattered streamers. Greasy rivulets seeped onto the tile in slow, viscous drips. By the time the lights recovered from their flickering, 4 clowns crouched in a shining tangle of limbs, all wearing twisted caricatures of painted grins, and as they too mimicked the original's pantomimes, groping at stunned diners and panting with crude delight, one could almost see the final traces of vitality ebbing from the room. Soon enough, another wave of convulsions seized them, birthing yet more abominations from their sundered forms, until 4 became 8, and the cycle of feeding and splitting began anew. Each time a new split occurred, the lights flickered in a frantic strobe, revealing glimpses of the atrocity: wet flesh, greasy fluids, the rending shriek of fabric and tendons. With every schism, the resulting clowns grew increasingly malformed. One bore a slack jaw drooping to its chest, revealing row upon row of jagged yellowing teeth. Another dragged a shattered leg behind it, but propelled itself forward on 2 long arms, leaving smeared trails of oil and blood in its wake. And still, they multiplied. Their laughter turned bestial, high-pitched giggles that mutated into guttural snarls, reverberating off the bold cartoon murals. They crawled over tables, slithered beneath booth seats, and even scrambled onto the ceiling, their hands and feet adhering to the tiles with horrifying ease. Each new monstrous clone seemed to carry less of the original's veneer of showmanship and more of a raw, primal hunger. The manager pressed himself against a soda dispenser that continued to silently drip syrup onto his shoes. His pulse roared in his ears, eyes darting from one nightmarish form to the next. Around him, the staff and customers mumbled half-formed pleasantries, clapped at erratic intervals, or recited fragments of the jingle under their breath. Their skin looked ashen, cheeks hollowed out. Some had turned a waxy, jaundiced color, sweat glistening on brows and upper lips. Yet a faint smile tugged at each mouth, as if they still believed this was all part of a grand, immersive performance. A man in a booth tried to take another bite of his burger, only to find his emaciated hands trembling too violently to lift it. He stared at the patty, transfixed, while a hunched clown perched on the edge of the table, drooling into his fries. When it launched itself toward the ceiling with a shriek, the man continued peering at his meal as though nothing had happened. His skin was nearly translucent, the veins beneath standing out like spiderwebs. In the center of the dining area, a child tumbled off a red plastic chair, landing face down on the tiled floor. Instead of crying, he remained there, body limp. The clown nearest him, its torso grotesquely elongated, features lost in a slick of dripping face paint, ran an oversized glove across the back of his skull. The child's limbs twitched, then went still. Even that final shudder seemed polite, subdued. The overhead jingle took on a discordant whine. Every speaker spat static until, with a sudden squeal, the battered tune returned at double speed, filling the restaurant with manic cheer. One of the newly split clowns danced to the rapid beat, limbs flailing in a macabre imitation of the earlier conga line. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, teeth slick with oil and flecks of gore. It wove among the booths, stepping over half-conscious patrons, searching for something fresh. Welcome. Welcome. Welcome to the show, hissed a trio of clowns perched along the service counter. Their voices overlapped in chaotic stutters, echoing each other's lines as they swelled with each new breath. A young cashier with a once-perfect perm stared at the clowns with adoration, though flecks of spittle trembled on her lips. Even as one of the clowns reached down, tracing a filthy nail along her cheek, she did not flinch. Another split tore through the restaurant, a deep, wrenching groan that punctuated the suffocating miasma. Two more abominations fell to the tile, shrieking as they emerged. Each was a confounding mess of limbs that seemed to move independently of a central skeleton. They scuttled sideways, leaving snail trails of grease behind them. When one righted itself, it let out a savage cackle, then lunged at the father who still clutched his dead camcorder like a crucifix. A wet thump. Then the father collapsed, eyes rolling back, as the clown's horrid mouth latched onto his shoulder. If anyone retained a shred of rationality, they made no sign of it. Indeed, several patrons continued to nibble on cold fries or half-eaten burgers. A woman in a polka-dot dress clapped limply in time to the sped-up jingle, the color drained from her lips. A gaunt toddler, his spindly neck struggling to hold up his oversized head, sat cross-legged on a table, giggling at a clown whose jaw snapped open and shut like a broken puppet. Nearby, his mother slumped lifelessly in a booth, offering no protest. Meanwhile, the manager slid behind the counter, his back scraping against the register's smooth plastic. He could see the reflection of his own face in the stainless steel beneath the warming lamps, pale and hollow, eyes wide with the knowledge that he was already lost. A cluster of clowns scuttled across the ceiling overhead, their dissonant cackles dripping down like poison. He felt his breath catch. The desire to run warred with the knowledge there was nowhere to go. The doors were blocked by a mass of half-formed clown bodies, a squirming tangle of red and yellow. Then came another grotesque spectacle with a soft thud. A patron, mid-bite of a cheeseburger, slumped forward in her seat. The overhead bulbs stuttered, bathing the scene in pulses of light. Her head lolled to the side, revealing a leathery face pulled taut over bone, eyes sunken into dark pits. Yet her lips stretched in a hideous approximation of a smile, jaw locked around the bite she never finished chewing. That was when the clowns converged, a writhing mass of limbs and dripping flesh that overtook booths, counters, and the playground area. Laughter, high, low, guttural, and shrill, resonated to the point of pain. The manager saw silhouettes pinned against plastic slides, arms flailing in half-hearted resistance before drooping in surrender. Small pools of grease, blood, and other fluids merged, forming a foul slick across the tile. He tried to stand, to speak, to do anything, but a wave of dizziness pressed him down. His vision blurred, and he swore he could feel the clown's hunger siphoning the life from him too. The last thing he registered before collapsing was the jingle, stuck on a looping cord that rose and fell in a maddening seesaw. Above him, a clown with 3 mismatched eyes peered down, grease dripping from its mouth, lips curled back in an endless grin. No one screamed. No one ran. In that fluorescent hellscape, every soul remained transfixed, half dead, as the unspeakable feast continued. Figures shrank to mummified husks, their final expressions twisted by that last, involuntary grin. The clowns spread through the restaurant in an orgy of flesh and grease, each new split birthing more abominations that slid and crawled, bearing unstoppable, manic life. At last, even the overhead lights failed, the final fluorescent tube flickering before sputtering out, plunging the restaurant into darkness. A single emergency lamp near the restrooms cast a pale, flickering glow across the wreckage. An endless cycle of grotesque shapes undulating over motionless bodies. Behind the counter, a single cash register beeped, a final sputter of a system that refused to die. But no one remained to hear it, no one left to cry out. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and frying oil, clinging to the wreckage like a shroud. A grainy security camera feed blinked to life, the timestamp dancing across the bottom edge. The screen showed the restaurant's interior, ravaged by the night's horrors. Overturned tables, collapsed play equipment, and scattered silhouettes of lifeless bodies, some still twitching in halting spasms. High up near the ceiling, the camera's angle provided a sweeping view of the devastation and an unobstructed window into the final act. "Yes, I'm watching now," came a dispassionate voice off-screen. "No, it's worse than last time, but maybe that's good for us. We'll see." On the monitor, the entrance doors swung open with a heavy push, admitting a team in full hazmat gear. They moved with calm, practiced efficiency, hefting canisters that led to hoses strapped with bulky nozzles. One figure waded through slumped bodies, stepping carefully to avoid small pools of greasy fluid. Slowly, they raised a foam cannon and squeezed the trigger. A sluggish white plume spilled forth, splattering over a mound of twitching clown remnants. The foam spread on contact, swelling and clinging as it thickened. Beneath it, the half-formed creatures writhed for agonizing moments, their oozing flesh hissing as the chemical brew seeped in. Slowly, they began to dissolve, their forms sagging into a ghastly, bubbling slurry. "Yes, hush money's already in motion, standard non-disclosure agreements," the voice confirmed, apparently to someone on the other end of a phone call. "We anticipated a larger event, given the burial ground. Of course we knew the risk." A pause, then a terse chuckle. "Well, it paid off. The data alone, yes, invaluable." The feed crackled and cut to another angle, a second foam cannon taking aim at the playground area, where half a dozen clown torsos still dragged themselves along the tile. It took over a minute of steady spraying before the slow-growing foam mounded high enough to fully envelop them, swallowing frantic arms and gnashing jaws, one agonizing inch at a time. Behind them, battered slides and toppled ball bins lay draped in a residue of dried gore. No one suspects a thing," the voice continued. "We'll spin it as a routine remodel. New paint, new staff, a few quiet payoffs to the families. They've all taken the settlement before. Why wouldn't they again?" Another pause. "Yes, tomorrow. We'll open on schedule." A flicker in the video feed revealed the hazmat crew moving methodically across the dining area, saturating every surface in the thick foam. Some clowns still had faint motion left, clawing at the tile in slow, desperate arcs. The foam crept over them like rising tidewater, taking its time to bubble and eat away the remains. Bit by bit, limbs gave way, dissolving into a viscous soup that hissed with chemical fumes. Yes, I'll remind them. We build on sacred ground. We get results, the voice said. No, that's not cynicism. It's just good business. The potential was clear from the start. At last, the footage switched to a final camera showing the kitchen area, transformed into another nightmare. The floor shimmered with a slick film of grease and dark fluids pooling in the grooves between tiles. The counters, though still intact, were smeared with viscera, cutlery scattered in disarray, some still coated in thick dripping residue. In one corner, a mound of what might have been food, or something far worse, steamed faintly, filling the air with a cloying, rancid heat. The hazmat team hosed everything down in a slow sweep, foam crawling with excruciating patience up the chair legs, over the seat cushions, and down the backs, until all that remained was a bubbled mass, ready to be scraped away. All right, the voice murmured. The rest is straightforward. We've done this before. We'll do it again if we have to. A series of muffled remarks sounded faintly through static. Yes, absolutely. Send the trucks first thing. We'll have a brand new grand opening before quarterly earnings. Finally, one of the hazmat workers stepped closer to the camera lens, a gloved hand briefly obscuring the feed. There was a flash of movement, and the screen shook, then went black. Uh-huh, the voice concluded. All set then. The data we've collected here alone is enough to justify the entire operation. Appreciate it. Tell the wife I said hello. Good night.
And that's where the line goes dead. Just a flicker of final movement before the corporate machine snaps everything to black. No more frantic footage of hazmat workers, no more disembodied voice haggling over hush money and data. It's just silence now, with the lingering reek of chemical foam and broken bodies echoing in our minds. I can't say how deep this operation runs, or how many times they've cleaned up a mess like this. All I know is the camera never lies, and what we've seen is too grotesque to dismiss as a remodel. Still, the feed cuts off here, leaving us in the dark. If there's another transmission out there, some frantic call or slip-up that survived, I'll keep listening for it. Maybe next time we'll catch more than a corporate monologue and a smear of foam dissolving the evidence. Until then, this place is officially under renovation, and its secrets are buried under chemical residue. But secrets have a way of seeping back to the surface, so stay tuned and keep your ears open. Something tells me this won't be the last we hear from them.